The story begins with a young man, barely in his 20s, struggling to carve out an existence in a world that seemed determined to keep him down. Born into poverty, life had never offered him the luxury of dreaming. Every day was a battle for survival, a relentless cycle of labor, exhaustion, and disappointment. His father had disappeared long ago, vanishing like a whisper in the wind, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a mother too hardened by life to offer much comfort. She wasn't the type to sugarcoat reality. If anything, she wielded her words like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. To her, a man without money was a man without worth, and she made sure her son understood that every time he came home empty-handed. "If your hands return empty, your stomach stays empty," she would say, her voice laced with impatience as she stirred a pot of soup that would never be shared with him. "Do I look like the government? Go and be useful or go to bed hungry. Your choice." No matter how many doors had been slammed in his face that day, no matter how many hours he had spent under the merciless sun doing backbreaking work, there was no sympathy waiting for him at home. Only his younger siblings, who looked up at him with hopeful eyes as if he had the power to change their fate. They didn't understand the weight of responsibility crushing his shoulders, the guilt that gnawed at him every time he had nothing to bring back. He had no stable job, no proper education, and certainly no one willing to offer a helping hand. His days were spent taking whatever work he could find, hauling sacks at the market, sweeping shop floors, running errands for impatient merchants, anything that would earn him a few coins. But the money was never enough. Some nights, hunger gnawed at his insides, twisting his stomach into knots. Other nights, it was the shame of his situation that hurt more than the emptiness in his belly. While he struggled to find his next meal, there was a woman in town who never had to worry about such things. She was rich, so rich that people whispered about the weight of her wealth, about how she could buy anything she wanted. And yet, for all her riches, she had no one. She lived in a mansion so grand, it stood like a silent monument to her loneliness. People respected her power, feared her sharp business acumen, but no one loved her. Over the years, she had built an empire, turning pennies into gold. Yet she had learned too late that money could not fill the void inside her heart. One evening, after another fruitless day of searching for work, the young man sat by the roadside, exhaustion clinging to him like a second skin. His stomach growled, reminding him of the meal he wouldn't be having. He had promised his siblings he would bring something home today. Instead, all he had was the taste of failure sitting bitter on his tongue. That was when he overheard two men talking nearby. Their voices were low, filled with amusement and disbelief. "Can you imagine? The old woman is looking for a husband," one of them said with a chuckle. "A husband?" the other scoffed. "Who in their right mind would agree to that?" The first man laughed. "Apparently she's offering a ridiculous amount of money for whoever is willing to marry her. Enough to change a man's life overnight." Somewhere in the conversation, someone muttered that no amount of money was worth such a thing, that even desperation had its limits. But the young man sat frozen, his mind racing. An opportunity like this didn't just appear out of nowhere. Could this be the answer? Could this be the way out of the never-ending hunger, the constant struggle, the shame of returning home empty-handed? It was a thought that twisted his stomach into knots. Marrying a woman old enough to be his grandmother? The idea made his skin crawl. But then he thought of his mother's sharp words, his siblings' hungry faces, the debts that loomed over him like a storm cloud. What was worse, swallowing his pride or spending the rest of his life fighting for scraps? His hesitation was short-lived. That very evening, with trembling hands and a heart heavy with uncertainty, he found himself standing before the towering gates of the old woman's mansion. The sheer size of the estate was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the cramped room he shared with his siblings. The air smelled of flowers, freshly cut grass, and something else, something cold, something that whispered of loneliness despite the grandeur. As the gates creaked open, he took a deep breath and stepped inside. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain: his life was about to change forever. Many nights he lay awake on the thin, tattered mat he called a bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, his mind tangled in thoughts he couldn't escape. Tomorrow would come too soon, bringing the same dreadful question: How would he feed his siblings? His younger brother and sister were too small to understand the full weight of their situation, but they could feel it. They never asked for what other children had. No toys, no sweets, not even a warm meal. They had learned to accept their reality with quiet resignation, their innocent eyes holding on to a hope he feared would soon fade. But his mother, she had no patience for hope. She stood over him, her sharp eyes filled with nothing but disappointment. "Just like your father," she muttered, her tone thick with resentment. "A man who promised the world and delivered nothing but suffering." He clenched his jaw, refusing to react. This wasn't new. It was a sermon she had been preaching for years. "Do you know what a real man does?" she continued, her voice cutting through him. "He provides. He doesn't come home with excuses. He doesn't sit around looking lost. But you walk through that door every night with empty hands, expecting what? A reward for being useless?" She clicked her tongue, shaking her head. "Your father was worthless, and you're following right in his footsteps." The words stung, but not because they were unexpected, because deep down he feared she was right. He had spent another day searching for work, enduring rejection after rejection, yet none of it mattered. Effort meant nothing if it didn't bring results. As his mother turned away, her disgust evident, his anger faded into something worse: defeat. But then his gaze shifted to his siblings, curled up in the corner, their small bodies wrapped in thin, worn-out fabric. They didn't deserve this. They didn't deserve to go to bed hungry, to wake up to the same hopeless reality. He wanted more for them. He needed more for them. A future where they didn't have to shrink themselves in fear of asking for the simplest joys. A home where they wouldn't have to huddle together when the rain leaked through the roof. A life where they could dream without knowing it was foolish. But dreams, he had learned, were for the rich. For people like him, survival was the only goal. The world, however, was not kind to the poor. People either ignored him or looked at him with disgust. Shopkeepers shooed him away if he lingered too long, afraid he might steal. The wealthy dismissed him with a flick of their hands, irritated by his mere existence. Even those who pitied him did nothing. They simply sighed, muttered about how unfair life was, then walked away, leaving him exactly where they found him. And no matter how hard he tried, he could never break free. The massive gates groaned as they swung open, revealing a servant standing stiffly at the entrance. His face gave nothing away. "She's been expecting you," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. Without another word, the servant turned, gesturing for him to follow. Inside, the house was enormous. Every inch of it dripped with luxury. The floors gleamed, polished to perfection. Heavy golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the vast, dimly lit hallway. Everything smelled of wealth, yet the air felt cold, hollow. As he walked, his own footsteps seemed too loud, as if he were intruding on a space not meant for him. At last, he was led into a grand room where she sat, poised and elegant, her back straight, her expression unreadable. She studied him, slowly, methodically. Her sharp eyes traced over his lean frame, his worn-out clothes, the uncertainty gripping his features. Then, in a voice that was calm yet unyielding, she spoke. "I want you to be my husband." His breath caught. For a second, he thought he must have misheard her. "I will give you wealth, security, a future," she continued as if discussing a business transaction. "In return, you will be mine." A strange, suffocating disbelief wrapped around him. This had to be a joke, a test, some cruel game. But her expression remained composed, expectant, waiting. She was dead serious. His entire being rebelled against it. Everything in him screamed that this was unnatural, that no man should be put in this position. But reality was merciless. His siblings' sunken faces flashed through his mind. The hunger, the hopelessness, the endless cycle of struggle. What future did he have beyond this? None. And so, despite the sickness curling in his stomach, despite the voice in his head telling him to run, he found himself nodding. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a haze, each one dragging him closer to the inevitable. He had agreed, not out of love, not out of devotion, but because life had left him no other option. Poverty had tied his hands, Desperation had stolen his dreams. And now fate had made its final move. The marriage was never about love. It was a desperate escape, a deal struck with fate to free himself from the misery that had clung to him since birth. Yet despite knowing this, an unbearable weight pressed against his chest. His mind churned with doubt, his heart a storm of emotions he couldn't control. Was this the right decision? Would he regret it for the rest of his life? Every time uncertainty crept in, the image of his younger siblings, hungry, tired, and without hope, burned in his mind. This wasn't just about him. He had no future, no way out, but they still had a chance. And if it meant swallowing his pride to give them a life where hunger wasn't their constant companion, then so be it. When he told his family, their reactions were immediate, loud, and filled with contradiction. His mother, for the first time in years, looked at him with something close to approval. Her lips curled into a proud smirk, and she clapped her hands together as if he had just achieved something remarkable. "Finally, you've done something right," she said, her voice carrying a triumphant ring. "See? You do have some sense in that thick skull of yours. Do you think suffering is a title you should carry with pride? Look at you, starving, struggling, breaking your back for pennies. Now you've secured a future. For yourself, for your siblings. This is how a man provides." The words twisted something deep inside him, but before he could say anything, his uncles had their turn. "Shameful," one of them scoffed, shaking his head in disgust. "A young man selling himself like livestock. Is this what it has come to? Do you even hear yourself?" another sneered. "Marrying a woman old enough to be your grandmother? You might as well wear a leash around your neck and call yourself a house pet." The judgment burned, but what choice did he have? He had spent years struggling, begging for scraps, enduring insults and humiliation just to put food on the table. None of them had ever stepped in to help. Not once. But now suddenly, they all had opinions. At least now he wouldn't have to crawl through life anymore. "At least we don't have to suffer anymore," he muttered under his breath. His fingers curled into fists as he looked at them, daring them to argue. "Or would you prefer we keep starving?" his mother huffed. "Let them talk," she said dismissively, waving her hand. "They sit on their high horse, but they're not the ones going to bed hungry. If you had listened to them, you'd still be out there, breaking your back for nothing. Let them choke on their pride. We'll eat instead." He wanted to feel relief, wanted to believe that this was the right path, but the unease inside him only grew. The day of the wedding arrived far too soon. The ceremony was nothing short of extravagant. The halls dripped with wealth, golden drapes cascading from the ceilings, tables overflowing with food so rich in scent it made his stomach twist. Guests arrived in silken jewels, their expressions carefully guarded, but he could feel their eyes on him. He could hear their whispers. He must have a price, and she named it. Poor boy. What kind of life is this? Disgusting. He's no better than a beggar who got lucky. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides. If only they knew. If only they had ever lived a single day in his shoes. He kept his head down, ignoring them as he walked toward the altar. His bride stood there, regal and composed, her gaze steady, unwavering. There was no hesitation in her, no uncertainty. She had made her decision long ago. Unlike him, she had no second thoughts. As the priest spoke, the words felt distant, muffled, like he was watching someone else's life play out before him. Then came the question, the one that sealed his fate. "Do you take her as your wife?" His throat tightened. The words wouldn't come. The weight of this moment was crushing. His mother's voice echoed in his head. "This is how a man provides." His siblings' faces flashed before his eyes. "At least we don't have to suffer anymore." With a breath so shaky he could barely contain it, he forced the words out. "I do." No one noticed the single tear that slipped down his cheek. The vows were spoken, the ceremony complete. The guests slowly filtered out, their polite smiles barely concealing their curiosity, their judgment. The world had already decided what he was, a boy who had sold his dignity for comfort. That night he stood alone in the grand bedroom, staring at the luxury surrounding him. The bed was large enough to swallow him whole, the walls lined with artwork worth more than everything he had ever owned. And yet, despite all of it, he had never felt so trapped. His new life had begun, but instead of freedom, it felt like the unraveling of everything he once was. The wedding had been grand, a spectacle draped in gold and wealth, but the moment it was over, reality settled in. This wasn't a love story. There was no tender touch, no warm embrace, only cold, calculated purpose. After the ceremony, she led him through the vast mansion, her steps confident, unwavering. He followed in silence, unsure of what to expect. His pulse quickened when they reached the master bedroom, his mind preparing for what he had convinced himself was inevitable. But instead of welcoming him inside, she stopped, gesturing toward a door across the hall. "That is your room," she said simply. His brows furrowed. "My room?" She gave a single nod. "You're not a prisoner here. Do as you please. Just remember your place." Her tone was indifferent, as though none of this mattered to her. "This is not the kind of marriage you think it is." With that, she turned and walked into her own quarters, shutting the door behind her. He stood there, frozen. He had braced himself for duty, for expectation, for something that would require him to surrender the last shreds of dignity he had left. But instead, he was being dismissed like a guest in his own home. Over the following days, he tried to impress her. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he felt useless, or maybe because the weight of his situation made him restless. He dressed well, carried himself with confidence, even attempted to engage her in conversation. She responded with nothing but indifference. At dinner, he would try to speak, but she would simply sip her wine, as if his words were insignificant. If he offered to assist with anything, she would wave him off as though he were an unnecessary presence. Even when he made an effort to show his gratitude for this life she had given him, she barely acknowledged it. It wasn't cruelty, it was something worse. She treated him like a possession, a fixture in the home, existing but unimportant. The longer this continued, the more it ate at him. One evening, after another silent dinner, he finally decided to confront her. "Why did you marry me?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. She barely glanced at him. "We've already had this conversation." "No," he pressed, frustration creeping into his tone. "I understand the arrangement, but why me? And if I'm not even fulfilling my role as your husband, then what exactly am I here for?" That made her pause. She studied him for a moment before setting down her glass. "You think marriage is only about physical obligation?" she asked, her voice unreadable. He swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. That had been his assumption, hadn't it? Wasn't that why men married women? Why women married men? She exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "I didn't marry you for companionship, nor for love." She leaned back, her sharp eyes locking onto his. "I married you because I needed someone I could control." The words sent a chill down his spine. She continued, her tone unwavering. "A man who has known suffering will never take comfort for granted. A man who has tasted hunger will never be foolish enough to waste. And a man who has fought for survival will do whatever it takes to keep what he's been given." She leaned forward slightly. "I didn't need a husband. I needed an heir, someone who understands the value of power and will protect what I built long after I'm gone." His stomach twisted. He had spent his life being overlooked, dismissed, treated as if he were invisible. And now he was chosen, but not as a partner, not as a husband, as a successor. It wasn't love, it wasn't devotion, it was control. That was what their marriage was built on. Not love, not devotion, not even companionship. She had chosen him because she could shape him into something useful, someone who would carry her legacy when she was gone. And yet, the more he tried to convince himself that he was just another pawn in her carefully laid plans, the more he saw her. The woman behind the cold, calculating exterior. She was not heartless. She was wounded. At first, he mistook her distance for arrogance, her sharp words for cruelty. But then came the moments when the ice cracked, revealing something else beneath. Like the way she always ensured his siblings had what they needed, yet never spoke of it. As if kindness was a weakness she refused to acknowledge. Or the late nights when he passed by her study and found her sitting in dim candlelight, staring at a glass of untouched wine, lost in thoughts that seemed to weigh heavier than all the gold in her possession. He tried to understand her. At times, she made it easy. A quiet conversation over dinner, a fleeting moment of warmth in her voice, a rare chuckle at something unexpected. And then, just as quickly, she would shut down. The kindness would disappear. The cold detachment would return, like a door slamming shut in his face. He observed the way she interacted with the world, how she carried a silent loneliness despite being surrounded by wealth and power. She had everything, yet she had nothing. She had been betrayed before. That much was clear, perhaps by lovers, perhaps by family. He didn't know, and she never spoke of it. But the way she flinched ever so slightly when someone showed her genuine kindness told him enough. One evening he found her in the garden, staring at the horizon as the sun dipped below the sky. She looked tired, not in the way one gets after a long day, but in the way someone gets after years of fighting battles no one sees. "You always look like you're carrying the world on your shoulders," he murmured, surprising even himself. She didn't turn to face him. "And you always look like you're trying to pretend you're not." A silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. For once, they didn't need words to understand each other. She was a woman who had been taken for granted, discarded when she was no longer useful. He was a boy who had been forced to be strong when all he had ever wanted was to be safe. They were both broken, but maybe, just maybe, they were learning how to exist in that brokenness together. That night, as he lay in his separate room, staring at the ceiling, he realized something. This wasn't just control. This wasn't just survival. This was something else entirely. Something neither of them knew how to name. The cold, calculating woman he had once believed her to be no longer seemed like a villain in his story. She was still distant, still guarded, but as time passed, his resentment dulled, replaced by something unfamiliar: understanding. He did not love her, not in the way a husband should love a wife, but the bitterness he once held for his circumstances slowly loosened its grip. She had given him something no one else ever had: security, a place where hunger was no longer his shadow, dignity, a life where he no longer had to beg for scraps or endure the pitying stares of strangers, a future, something he had never dared to imagine for himself. And though their marriage was not built on love, he could no longer deny that in her own way, she had saved him. The next day, as they sat across from each other at the long dining table, the usual silence stretched between them. The only sounds were the soft clink of silverware against fine china and the faint crackle of the fireplace in the distance. Then out of nowhere she spoke. "Are you happy?" Her voice was steady, but something about the way she asked made him pause. It wasn't a casual question. It was something deeper, something that carried weight, as if his answer mattered more than she was willing to admit. He stared at her, trying to read what lay behind those sharp eyes. But for once, he couldn't. Happiness. The word sat heavy in his mind, foreign and unfamiliar. It was something he had never allowed himself to chase, something he had always considered a privilege meant for others. He had spent his life surviving, not dreaming. And yet, as he looked at her, as he thought of the life he had left behind, he realized something. For the first time, he was not waking up with an empty stomach. For the first time, he wasn't being shooed away like an unwanted stray. For the first time, his siblings were sleeping in warm beds, laughter returning to their voices. His mother, once filled with disappointment every time she looked at him, now beamed with pride, calling him a man for securing their future. The world still whispered, still sneered at the sight of him beside her. But those whispers didn't change the fact that, in his own way, he had won. He met her gaze, and, though he wasn't sure what happiness truly felt like, he knew this. He was no longer afraid of tomorrow. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough. The whispers never faded. They clung to him like shadows, slithering through the streets, through the walls of the mansion, through every space he occupied. No matter how much time passed, he remained nothing more than a scandal. Look at him, nothing but a gold digger. A boy with no shame, waiting for an old woman to drop dead so he can enjoy her wealth. She's a fool, thinking money can buy loyalty. He'll leave the moment he has enough. It should have stopped hurting by now, but some wounds never fully heal. Back when he was poor, they ignored him. Back when he begged for work, when he fought to survive, they treated him like he didn't exist. But now they wouldn't look away. Now he was entertainment, but the cruelty of strangers was nothing compared to the words of his own blood. His uncles, the same men who once called him a curse, who once said he would bring nothing but shame, were suddenly reaching out. "It's been so long, son. You know blood is thicker than water. Family helps family. Your cousin needs money for his business, just a small loan. You wouldn't deny your own family, would you?" They came to him with smiles, with empty praise, with hands outstretched, while behind his back they whispered the same names they always had. A disgrace. A boy who sold his dignity for comfort. He thinks money changes who he is? We know what he came from. We know what he really is. But the most painful words never came from them. They came from her. His mother had always been brutal in the way she spoke to him, her words sharper than any blade. "You're just like your father, weak, useless, always chasing what you'll never have. Why do you even come home empty-handed? You think suffering is a full-time job? A man who cannot provide is not a man at all." For years, her disappointment crushed him more than hunger ever had. And yet the moment he stepped into wealth, the moment he had something, she changed. Her insults became praise. Now this is what a real man does. Look at them, jealous of you. Let them talk. They wanted you to stay beneath them, but you rose above. "You saved us, my son. You made the right choice." She had never been proud of him when he struggled, only when he won. But was this really a victory? The thought of escaping, of running from all of this, clawed at his mind more and more. He had enough money now. He could start fresh, live without the whispers, without the expectations, build a life that was truly his. But then he would see her, the woman who had given him a way out, the woman who, for all her coldness, had never asked anything of him beyond loyalty. She never demanded love, never forced him to be something he wasn't. She had been betrayed before, forgotten, used. Would he become just another person who abandoned her? He had escaped poverty, but had he truly found peace? If it were you, what would you do? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next.